So welcome to this Dharma talk. Over the Easter weekend, which was last weekend, if you're listening to this on a recording, I spent time with two of my sons and their families, which included 5 grandchildren. And it's such a delight to be with my grandchildren, most times. And it was wonderful to watch the children play, sing, and simply be themselves as we shared time, space, food and laughter. Yet, despite this joy, my heart felt heavy with fear, worry, anger and a deep, deep sadness. When I looked into it, was this sadness. And I couldn't help but think of the children in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran and Israel and all other places of conflict, whose cherished lives have been so tragically cut short. These little beings being bombed. And I sat with the devastating question of how I would feel if I returned home one day to find my own loved ones murdered, dead, destroyed. And in the shadow of such loss, local concerns such as fuel shortages seem trivial. Yet I recognise that even these issues can lead to pretty severe hunger, because we don't have trucks, no deliveries to Woolworths, we might have food shortages. And it could lead to a complete upheaval of the world as we know it, economic collapse and so on. So in a world grappling with war, injustice and environmental crisis, it is only natural that we may feel overwhelmed with anger, fear and grief. These challenges are often fueled by the same mental distortions that we face internally: greed, ignorance and hatred. So in this talk, I'd like to explore how we can transform these heavy emotions into wise, compassionate action. And together I hope we can look closely at the nature of anger. All these emotions are coming up in this circumstance, in this current crisis. But I thought we'd look at least one emotion, the one of anger, and the vital role that conscience could play in helping us respond to the global turmoil with both heart and effectiveness. So, under the instructions of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Buddhist scholar B. Alan Wallace and emotions expert psychologist Paul Ekman developed a program called Cultivating Emotional Balance. And I think at least one of you have been on a program that I taught on this. I think I can see someone nodding there. And as the name suggests, this program, the primary goal of this program is to reduce suffering and find freedom from destructive emotions. The program explains that emotions evolved for us to aid our human survival, communication, connection and motivation. However, while emotions have a vital function and can be incredibly constructive in these processes of being human, they can also become destructive when they are excessive, deficient or dysfunctional. CEB, or Cultivating Emotional Balance, focuses on managing the 7 universally expressed emotions, which are happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, contempt and disgust. And it looks to balance the imbalances. It looks to shift the destructive emotions to constructive emotions. And the way they explain these emotions is that every emotion has an evolved function. And the function of anger, and I'll just talk about anger here, the function of anger is that it provides the energy to overcome obstacles. Obstacles that are blocking our path to progress, or doing what we want to do, or what we think is important. And so they provide the energy to overcome these obstacles, address injustice, and protect oneself and others from harm. So they have a powerful function. However, as mentioned earlier, they can be excessive, deficient, or dysfunctional. An example of when anger is not balanced and is excessive is like, for example, frequent road rage or explosive outbursts over minor inconveniences. An example of when it's deficient is when we don't stand up for ourselves, when we're intimidated or threatened or bullied. And when they're an example of when it's dysfunctional is when intense anger towards a friend, we feel an intense anger towards a friend who's actually trying to help us. So Ekman describes that there's an emotional timeline, and involved in this timeline is the preconditions, like our preconditioning or our conditioning as a human being, and this can come from experience and our lives, and also a precondition is our evolutionary past, some things that are just innate, some things that are just part of our DNA, so to speak. And this timeline also includes a trigger, and a trigger is an event that occurs that matches the theme of our emotional database. We have an emotional database, which is the ways I was talking about the preconditions, like our personal history and our culture and our evolutionary past. And then we have a trigger. It could be anything. It could be saying something or someone acting towards us in a particular way or whatever. And then there's a refractory period. The refractory period refers to when we enter that state of emotion, and we can only process information that supports the emotion we are feeling. Like if it's happiness, for example, we see happiness all around us. If it's fear, we only see what's frightening us. If it's anger, we only see the things that justify our anger. Our minds, with this refractory period, our minds become very narrowly focused. They just see this stuff and they don't see anything much more than that. And the other thing that happens in this emotional timeline is a response, and it's physiological changes such as heart rate, blood pressure, facial expressions. Actually, a good way to detect an emotion is listening to one's voice, like a voice. You can detect emotions very easily in people's voices. You can also detect them in their facial expressions. Paul Ekman developed being able to recognize micro emotions, and they use that in a lot of different ways. But so the other things that happen with the physiological changes are facial expressions and action tendencies. And an action tendency with anger, for example, is the urge to strike or to shout with anger. With fear, our legs might shake. We might get shaky legs, and that's helping us get ready to run. With anger, on the other hand, often people feel kind of a tension in their upper body, and they might clench their fists. That's in preparation to hit out. It's really interesting. So, with the CEB framework, we address destructive anger by staying mindful of its initial spark, like being ready to see its initial spark, like when it's triggered. You're kind of detecting that, and then refusing to give it oxygen. In other words, refusing to feed it. By recognizing our triggers and choosing not to feed them, we achieve two things. First of all, we shorten the refractory period. In other words, we might see anger arise, but we don't feed into it, and therefore we don't get caught up in this whole timeline of an emotion that lasts or longer than it needs to last, we might feed into it, and we are gripped by the emotion and unable to see other perspectives. So if we can be aware of the trigger and not feed into it, that can happen. The other thing that can happen is we can decondition reactions. We begin to unlearn habitual impulsive responses. Actually, when you have an emotion, and this is the way I understand it, it's like Vedana. It's like feeling in the way we understand feeling tone in Buddhist psychology. You can't control feeling tone arising. It's just going to arise. You can't say, I'm not going to have a pleasant experience when I eat this bar of chocolate, unless you have some, it makes you feel nauseous or something that could be unpleasant. But you can't control the Vedana that arises. And it's like that. We can't necessarily control an emotion arising. It just arises. But what we can do is we can shorten the refractory period, and also we can decondition the arising of anger. And I think a lot of we can find that deconditioning in Buddhist meditation practices, in particular mindfulness. So central to emotional balancing is mindfulness, and this practice allows us to manage our reactions with an awareness of an evolved human being. And this approach of being aware of when we're triggered, not feeding into it, aligns to many spiritual traditions. I think I forgot to mention that in this talk I'll be talking about several different approaches to anger, including the Buddhist approach, of course, but also I wanted to mention a Christian approach to anger, which could be represented by a quote by St. Thomas Aquinas, who was around in the 13th century. He who is not angry when there is a just cause for anger is immoral. Why? Because anger looks at the good of justice. If you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral. You are immoral as well as unjust. Pretty powerful saying. And this scholar, I think he was a scholar, St. Thomas Aquinas, he taught that anger is a passion that can be directed by reason when it is used to seek the redress of injury in accordance with justice. He termed it zealous anger, and he considered that it is a virtuous expression of fortitude. But the orthodox Theravadan approach to anger is a little bit different than what St. Thomas is talking about. I went on a retreat in 2018 with Analia. Analia, as many of you know who Analia is a Buddhist scholar, practitioner, teacher who's really, he's kind of genius-like in that respect. And I went on a retreat with him, and we were talking about all sorts of things, of course, and with the ideas of the CEB balancing emotions in mind, I asked if anger can ever be wholesome, like the way it's talked about with St. Thomas. And I spoke about how the anger we had as a community in Lismore against the CSG mining enabled us to have the energy to protest. And with that energy to protest, we stopped CSG mining in Lismore. So I said that it was having a purpose. It was to a greater good. And this anger provided us the energy to protest and right what we felt was wrong. And Analayo didn't agree with my thoughts. And he equated anger as equivalent to the hindrance, the meditation hindrance, and the practice hindrance called of ill will, and stated firmly that anger could never be wholesome. On that occasion, I chose to disagree with Analayo and thought that anger is a human emotion that arises because of conditions, and what matters is how we work with what may arise. And I thought that one can experience anger, but not necessarily have ill will, which is the second hindrance. Since then, my thoughts have changed a little bit, where I can see that aversion is truly one of the root causes of suffering, and it can be very, very, very subtle. And to support my change in thinking, I was listening to a talk, as I mentioned earlier, with Rick Hansen, Paul Gilbert, and Tara Brach. It was more of like a discussion. It was a great discussion. And I listened to Tara Brach, who quoted a very wise person as saying that anger is powerful to initiate action to right that which is wrong, but it is not transformative. And this is how I changed my mind, because anger is great to initiate the energy to change things. But when it comes to inner transformation, if we still have anger in our heart, it will block us from waking up. It will block us. It will continue to be a root cause of suffering for us. So the transformation is internally. It can change something on the outside world, but it doesn't change things on the inside world if we let it fester. In the Theravada tradition, anger, or dosa, is viewed as a destructive root of suffering, and it must be entirely abandoned and uprooted. The goal of the practice is the total release of anger, and as this is essential for true peace, as anger primarily burns the person holding it. It's like giving a poison. It's like drinking a poison that we're trying to give to someone else, really. So, and from a Theravadan Buddhist perspective, suffering is caused by the mind's internal reactions, not by external triggers. And of course, the antidotes for anger from a Theravadan Buddhist perspective is replacing ill will with active loving kindness or metta, recognizing the temporary, or recognize anicca, or the temporary changing nature of the state of mind, as well as the self and the provocateur of the anger. And understanding karma as well, understanding that we alone own the consequences of our negative choices. Everyone is on their own life trajectory. And you can't transfer karma, which, as you know, translates as actions. You can't transfer karmas to another person. Everyone has to be responsible for their own actions, because the consequences of those actions come within our own life trajectory, if that makes sense. There's a famous simile that the Buddha spoke about. And it's called the simile of the saw in the Theravadan traditions. And he stated that even if bandits were to cut off your limbs, if you felt a trace of anger towards them, you would not be following the Buddhist teachings. So, I mean, it's pretty extreme. I don't think I feel that I'm a follower of the Buddha, but I'm certain at my current level of practice, I wouldn't be able to not have some aversion or anger towards someone cutting off my limbs. A few days ago, when I was listening to the news, and a powerful politician who I'd prefer not to name because I don't want to feed into his malignant narcissism, I was listening to him tell the world that if Iran did not comply with his demands, their whole civilization would die in one night. It would be bombed back into the Stone Age, and the people back to where they belong in the Stone Age. The word hate arose in my mind. And so I had hate. I had ill will. And the same ill will arose when I heard the Prime Minister of Israel ordered an escalation of bombing in the suburbs of Lebanon only hours after a ceasefire was announced. I mean, it's the same thing. I see these individuals, I hear them, and I have anger. I have ill will. I'm not yet at that position where I can view them with loving kindness. Some practitioners find loving kindness difficult, of course, and we often feel a failure and inadequate when we can't cultivate it towards people that might be bombing the world. And we might feel this especially when anger arises as a conditioned response. And I've certainly got a long way to go in that respect. But if I can begin to be mindful of my rage and accepting this rage as my reaction, and with mindfulness and investigation, it is possible to reduce the refractory period of this emotion. Like I was saying before, it's possible to catch it and reduce the refractory period. And from that, it is possible to actually develop equanimity. It's possible. And with equanimity, we can act more skillfully rather than being consumed with our anger. Still, in good conscience, I feel it is right to call out the blatantly harmful actions and scream, "Stop!" I feel I'm right to protest. Last year, I read an article that was calling out Buddhist teachers for remaining silent about social oppression and genocide that was happening then and is still happening in Gaza. The criticisms and the suggestions for actions were warranted. As I read this article, I noticed that sometimes I feel it a challenge to speak out when I notice wrongdoing in another. I must admit I'm quite conflict avoidant. I don't like to be in conflicts. And also, I think that also I've had experience with challenging people's views on certain things, and all it does is strengthen their position while they get into an argument. I get into an argument, and it seems to be useless to try to change another's view. So I tend to withdraw from engaging in conversations where there's strong views. And another thing is that when I was a monk, there is a sutta about useless speech, wasteful speech, and idle speech. And the Buddha recommends not to do it. And this sort of speech involves discussion about the marketplace, politicians, kings and wars and so on. And when I was a monk, we never talked about politics. Never, ever. It just wasn't part of the practice. We never expressed an opinion about political situations. And in this sutta, the Buddha said it's a waste of time, not helpful to have these discussions, and rather he encouraged timely Dharma discussions about the realities of the Four Noble Truths. So I think that I've been kind of a little bit conditioned by that. So talking about my reservations to call wrongness out, and reflecting on conscience, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think that we need to be very flexible about how we interpret these particular teachings, especially when we're confronted with killing, gross injustice, violations of human rights. Because when we are silent, when we're confronted with this silent indifference, which is and disengagement, could be considered as the near enemy of equanimity. And by near enemy, I mean a distorted misrepresentation of equanimity. Equanimity, of course, is being balanced and steady and stable. And true equanimity is actually balanced. The way we work with the near enemy of equanimity, which is this indifference, this disengagement, it's almost an aloof superiority, like we're above that. The way we work with that is temper that with compassion. Like, I think the true equanimity is balanced by compassion. So we have the capacity to see the way things actually are, accept the reality of that situation, yet have a softness and a gentleness and a tenderness in our heart to respond effectively. So when we are confronted with the killing and gross injustice and violence of violations of human rights, I think it's quite important that we act. And if we remain silent when we witness gross injustice, it's a denial of aligning to the Dharma as we see it in the Four Noble Truths. When we're speaking out, we're having an alignment with the discussion of the Four Noble Truths as they manifest in the external world. That's what I'm trying to say. And in a talk I gave about 2 months ago, and the talk was about how the world is burning with greed, ignorance and hatred, I said that by remaining silent about what we clearly see as unethical and harmful violations of human rights could be considered as colluding with these behaviours. Remaining silent could also be considered as wrong speech and unethical. Some situations could be compared to bullies in the school playground. By not standing up for those who are being bullied, are we colluding with the bullies and just reinforcing their unwholesome behaviours? And in my view, unfortunately, this is not calling out what is happening. The not calling out of what's happening on a global scale by some powerful bully politicians is in many respects just reinforcing it. It's just feeding into it. When I went to high school in 1968 through to 1973, it was at Turramurra High School actually, the motto for my school was obedience to conscience. And I think that was a powerful teachings for life. It's interesting because you don't hear that word much these days, conscience. And I'm not sure why, but maybe, values have changed or something like that. Nonetheless, I think that there's an overlap with this motto and a wholesome pattern which in Buddhist Pali is called Hiri Ottappa. And Hiri Ottappa is often referred to as the guardians of the world. Hiri is often translated as healthy or wise shame, but it's more accurately described as moral self-respect and conscientiousness. It's an internal compass for how we act and respond in the world. And Ottappa is translated as moral dread or moral caution. Sometimes it's described as fear of negative consequences, like seeing this situation. And Ottappa is externally directed, and it is the awareness of the consequences of unskillful actions. Together, this hiri ottappa, they form the foundation of moral integrity and social harmony. Without these two qualities, it is said that society would lose its sense of decency and revert to a state of chaos. In my view, some very powerful leaders of the world are currently acting in a way that is shameless. They lack conscience. While the world leaders must be held accountable for their actions, we must avoid being poisoned by the very anger we condemn. As the Dhammapada teaches, hatred will not cease by hatred, but by love alone. Currently, the cycle of violence in the Middle East, driven by the belief that our adversaries must be eradicated, must be killed through indiscriminate force, with annihilated, that must be destroyed. And in my view, that view only fuels further retaliation, creating a human hell. Like one person tries to destroy the other and it just escalates. In that talk I gave a couple of months ago, I talked about Mosen Madami, and this peace activist offers a different way forward. Despite growing up in a refugee camp in Gaza and witnessing horrific violence, or it might have been in West Bank, I think it was in the West Bank, and witnessing horrific violence, Madami used Buddhist mindfulness to process his rage. By looking through the veils of hatred, as well as greed and ignorance, he began to recognize the common humanity of his oppressors. This transformation of anger into compassion is a core tenet of engaged Buddhism, suggesting that true healing and peace start with internal change. This term, engaged Buddhism, was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh. It emerged during the Vietnam War as a response to the immense suffering caused in this conflict. Thich Nhat Hanh and his colleagues in the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam were faced with a dilemma. Should they remain in the monasteries practicing meditation, or go out to help those affected by the bombing and the turmoil? He argued that one could do both. Famously, he said, "Meditation is not to escape from society, but to come back to ourselves and see what is going on. Once there is seeing, there must be acting." Engaged Buddhism does not disagree with the Theravadan view that anger is destructive. However, it shifts the focus towards social interconnectedness and compassionate action. From this perspective, anger is seen as compost. And Thich Nhat Hanh used the metaphor of a gardener. Anger is like organic waste. It smells bad and is unpleasant, but a skilled gardener doesn't throw it away. They use it to make compost to grow beautiful flowers, the flowers of compassion and understanding. Another part of engaged Buddhism is that it emphasizes interbeing, and that the oppressor is also a victim of their own ignorance, environment, and upbringing. Anger is transformed into fierce compassion that stops the harm without hating the harmer. So, the weight of the global crises, climate change, social injustice, and war, can evoke overwhelming anger, fear, and grief. However, I had a phone call with one of the Sangha members actually, a couple of weeks back, and she asked how I was, and I said, "Oh, not too bad, considering the maelstrom of madness happening in the world." And she said to me, Mal, as long as there's good people in the world, good things are going to happen. I thought, fantastic. So I was reminded by her that as long as there's good people exist, positive change is possible. And through the Sangha, or the community, we find the strength to act together rather than suffer in isolation. So, just connecting and talking is amazingly powerful. Just having a Sangha. And I was going to look up the validity of this, but I think Thich Nhat Hanh once said the next Buddha will be a Sangha. Be a collection of beings working together, not as an individual, but as a collection, as a Sangha. And I see that, we can work alone or we can work together, and it's so much more powerful than working together. And on that coalition of compassion talk with Rick Hansen, when Rick Hansen was talking about how to move beyond us and them, he was mentioning how many little groups around the world are all working towards the wholesome. We're all working towards freedom and liberation and well-being of people, and freeing people up from suffering, and working towards justice and so on. So my heart is buoyed by that recognition. And only a couple of weeks ago, I sat on a retreat run by, it was a walking retreat where we sat 2 days in silence in the lodge, but the rest of the time, the other 5 days, we were walking around Charles Pass in the beautiful Snowy Mountains National Park. It was awesome. It was fantastic. And Susie Brown and Victor Vanderheide would give Dharma talks in the evenings on all the nights. And one talk Susie Brown gave was on interbeing. And so she was talking about interbeing. And she said that she went to the, a couple in 2020, I think it was, when the children and the students of Australia and around the world were standing up against climate change. They were striking. They were getting on the streets and striking. She said she went there and she looked around, and there were lots of students but not many parents. So she wondered what was happening here. So she started to organise, she started to put out about how parents can get together to act towards climate change. And a few years later now, she's got this organisation called Parents for Climate Action, and it's got thousands and thousands of members, and they do things. And when I was speaking with Susie, when she was giving this Dharma talk, she was getting ready to go down to lobby the politicians in Canberra about getting solar panels on preschools across Australia. Fantastic. So these things happen as groups. These things can happen. And you remember a couple of months ago, how long ago was it now? Was it a month ago or a little bit more? Those monks for peace, walking across the United States, acting silently, walking silently. They weren't putting anybody down. They weren't doing anything other than walking for peace, by being an example of how peace can actually happen. And I was talking to my supervisor. I'm doing some supervision with a Dharma teacher who is doing a PhD on Buddhist activism. And just talking with her was really great. This is what I'm talking about how we together as a Sangha can work through this. And just talking with her, and she said she had a dream. She had a dream that thousands of Buddhists would just go on protests and stand silently and walk silently with placards saying, Buddhists for peace. And that would have an impact, similar impact than that we saw with the monks for peace walking in the US. So working together, we can drop by drop create peace. refusing to feed into the mental distortions of greed, ignorance and hatred, and understanding the law of karma, the wholesome intentions that lead to wholesome outcomes. This understanding gives us great confidence and capacity to act with integrity and equanimity and compassion. So another thing here we do is actually we turn towards the pain rather than rather than trying to avoid it all the time by distracting ourselves. We turn towards the pain. Instead of fleeing from painful emotions, we can turn towards them with courage and honesty. And with mindful presence, by sitting with our suffering and applying mindfulness, benevolence, and the 7 factors of awakening, and I'll just repeat them so to remind you. 7 factors of awakening are mindfulness, investigation of dhammas, energy or effort, joy, tranquility, concentration, meditative concentration, which is samadhi, and equipoise or equanimity. This final one, they don't have to be always been done in that sequence, by the way, but this final one is the capacity to see clearly and realize the way things are, and not deny that, but accept that as the reality of this moment. This is the reality of this moment, rather than being reactive and being consumed with reactive emotions and reactive responses. We are more capable of choosing what to do in a way that is very effective and doesn't feed into those cycles of suffering that are driven by greed, ignorance and hatred. And interconnection, seeing our shared reality, fosters a deep value for all living beings. Sometimes when I look at my grandchildren, I see their innate goodness. I know we talked about innate goodness. I see their Buddha nature. I see something really, it's more than beautiful, because beautiful is kind of putting a label on it, but it's just this beautifulness of this interconnection. And then what I can do is every now and then, I just sit and look at people in the supermarket or people on wherever I am, and I can see the same thing. It's so beautiful. And it's when we can see people's innate goodness, when we can see this interconnection, we can't help but live with impeccable ethics. We can't help but live with good conscience, because to harm them is to harm us. It's just the difference disappears. We are all interconnected, and we realize through our own experience that ancient law: hatred will not cease by hatred, but by love alone. So, thank you very much for your compassionate attention, and let's have a few moments silence and digest the Dharma talk and have some discussion.